All right. Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth session of the Language Documentation Training Center Advanced Documentation Webinar Series. My name is Greg Vondiziano. I'm a PhD student at University of Hawaii, and today I'm going to be talking to you about advanced concepts in morphosyntax. So I'm going to go over first the roadmap with all of you. So I'm going to start off today's webinar by just kind of briefly reviewing the topics that we covered in our basic webinar series. So this is going to be a review of kind of the basic principles of morphology, and then a review of so-called syntactic categories. And then for today, we're going to extend that by talking about two sets of descriptive tools that, while not directly related to documentation per se, are critical for syntactic description. So we're going to be talking first about thematic roles, and then we're going to talk about grammatical relations. These two concepts they definitely err more on the side of linguistic analysis, syntactic analysis, but these analytical tools will help us kind of begin to be able to peer into the structures that we observe in the languages that we document, so that we can ultimately provide a more accurate syntactic characterization of whatever languages that we're working with. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. All right, so let's start off with our review. So this morphology is one of the basic subfields of linguistics. It's something that I'm sure most of you have some exposure to. But morphology is effectively the study of words and word structures. Now, the basic pieces of morphology that we need to make sure that we are familiar with as documentary linguists are essentially morphemes. So a morpheme is what we call the smallest part of a word that carries a basic meaning. So this is a constituent part that's larger than a phonetic segment. It's composed of one or more phonemes, typically. And generally, these are, at minimum, one-syllable constituents, although in some highly synthetic languages, there might be morphology or morphemes that consist of just a single segment, either a consonant or a vowel. But so long as it is a meaning-bearing element, then it would qualify as a morpheme. Okay, now there are two types of morphemes that we went over in our first webinar series. So the first is what's called a stem or a base. And this is the smallest piece of information, this is the smallest meaning-bearing piece, that can also function independently as a word. So these are constituents that can occur on their own without any further morphological modification, and still adequately and grammatically convey meaning. So these are what we would think of as words, quite frankly. So for example, in English, examples of stems or bases would be car, tree, run, blue. They don't necessarily have to be monosyllabic, although many stems and bases can be. And depending on the language family, your sort of stem or base, the number of syllables that composes a common stem or base is going to be a little bit different. I added also some Hawaiian examples of stems or bases. So the verb hele, to go, kumu, root or source, and hale, house. So throughout my talk today, I'm going to be relying primarily on examples from English and Hawaiian. English because that's a language that all of us are familiar with and serves as a useful reference point for talking about the phenomenon that we're going to be discussing. But I've also included Hawaiian, not only because it is the language ancestrally spoken on the islands here in Hawaii, but also because it is a non-Indo-European language. It's an Austronesian language. So we get a nice kind of comparison between a language we're familiar with and a language that we maybe aren't familiar with. Okay, so the second type of morpheme that we need to know about are what are called affixes. Now, there are different kinds of affixes. There are prefixes, which are affixes that are added to the beginning of a word, and there are suffixes, which are affixes that are added to the end of a word. And while I didn't put any examples here, there's also what are called infixes, and these are affixes that are added into the stem or the base. So affixes, when they are added to a stem or a base, they can either change the meaning of the word or they can add grammatical information. But the key differentiating characteristic of an affix is that it cannot stand alone. These are elements that need a host element. They need to attach to a stem or a base in order to have meaning or in order to function appropriately. So examples of a couple prefixes from English, we have re attached to the base run, which gives us the verb rerun, or a noun rerun. The prefix pre affixed to the base test to create the word pretest, and then un affixed to the verb do to create the new verb undo. Suffixes, we have some examples. And then my Hawaiian example, we have a causative prefix ho'o added to the verb hele, creating the word ho'ohele, to cause to go. Examples of suffixes from English would be suffixes like able, ing, and So I have our examples here: do, able, which is an adjective; running, which is also misspelled, apologies, there should be another N in there; and then also er affixed to the base test, creating tester. And then in Hawaiian, I have an example of the bound negative, the bound negator ole, attached to the word ike ole, not knowing. Okay, now within affixes, there's another subdivision that we need to quickly review. So depending on the function of the affix, we can classify it as either a derivational affix or an inflectional affix. So derivational affixes are those affixes that add new semantic content or new meaning. And then, so in so doing, when they attach to the base, they change the meaning of the base and generally create a new word, which is another feature of derivational affixes. They create new words, and they can change the syntactic category of the base. So if the base is a noun, they could change it to an adjective, or if the base is a verb, they could change it to a noun. So I have some examples here just from English. We have speak, which is a verb. We add the suffix and we get speaker, the noun meaning one who is speaking. Similarly, stand, we add the prefix under, creating a new verb understand, meaning to perceive the intended meaning rather than stand on your two legs or however many legs you might have. Lastly, love, the verb, we add the suffix able, creating the new adjective lovable, able to be loved. Now, inflectional affixes, on the other hand, are affixes that add grammatical information but do not create a new word, nor can they change the syntactic category of the base. They simply function to add grammatical content, to add grammatical meaning. So inflectional affixes we're probably most familiar with in inflection schemas of European verbal systems, right, where the verbs are inflected to reflect tense and number, or number of people. So examples again from English, the verb cook, we add ing to create cooking, which is the present progressive tense aspect of the verb cook. Similarly, we can add the past tense inflectional suffix ed to create the past tense form of the verb, cooked. So in both of these cases, the root meaning of cook is not changing, but we're adding a layer of grammatical information to tell us more, to give more specific information about the tense or continuity of the action, when it's happening, and how completed the action is. All right, so now quickly moving on to syntactic categories. The three major syntactic categories that we need to be familiar with are nouns, verbs, and adjectives. These, of course, are terms that many of us learn in grammar school, and so we have an understanding of what they are semantically. So nouns tend to denote people, places, objects, and things and ideas. Verbs tend to denote actions or states, and adjectives tend to ascribe some property to typically a noun. However, linguistically speaking, we do actually have syntactic diagnostics that we can use to probe at the actual structural behavior of these syntactic categories and give them a more structural definition that doesn't resort to meaning. So nouns, syntactically speaking, are elements that can occur with markers of definiteness and specificity, such as determiners. So these are words like the, this, also possessive determiners like his, her, its, my. So you see here in my examples from English, the child, this table, her pen, and then the Hawaiian equivalents, ke keiki, keia pakaukou, kana penikala. So these are determiners. They narrow down they add definiteness and specificity information to the noun, and they can only occur with the syntactic category of noun. Verbs, on the other hand, are elements that can occur with tense, aspect, and modality marking as they are expressed by either auxiliary verbs or inflection. So inflectional suffixes are going to show up on verb bases, verbs that belong to the syntactic, or roots that belong to the syntactic category of verb. So in English, we mark tense and aspect and modality using both auxiliary verbs and inflectional suffixes. So in our example here, will is an auxiliary verb indicating future action, will go. Is an auxiliary verb that is used with the present progressive ing, is eating. Had is an auxiliary verb used with perfective aspect, he had written. And then I also, again, provide Hawaiian equivalents with their tense and aspect markers. E hele, will or should go. Ke ainei is eating, and wakako, wrote or had written. And then lastly, adjectives are elements that can occur with degree marking, such as degree words. Now that's kind of a vague description, but degree words are words that modify the intensity of the property denoted by the adjective. Basically words like very, kind of, a little bit, extremely, right? Things that can either emphasize or de-emphasize a particular property. So our English examples, again, here we have very big, kind of blue, a little bit interesting. So these are all degree marking elements that can only be affixed to, or can only associate with, adjectives or stems below the category of adjective. Again, I've provided the Hawaiian equivalents, nui loa, very big, ano uli uli, kind of blue, ano hoi hoi, kind of interesting or a little bit interesting. Okay, so that's a very quick review of the content of the first Morphosyntax webinar. And now we're going to move into the new content for today's talk. So we're going to start off by talking about what are called thematic roles. So you may have heard this word before if you've ever taken an introductory syntax course, but thematic roles are semantic functions of constituent parts of a sentence. So with these, we're dealing with meaning. Now, just a minute ago, I said that syntactic categories can't be identified based on their semantic properties, right? So what are we doing looking at the semantic functions of constituent parts of a sentence? And that's a very good question, and it will become clear by the end of this section. So thematic roles, as we define them as semantically defined labels that originate from word meaning. So with these, we are referring back to the meanings of words, and we have to do this in order to start taking preliminary steps towards syntactic description, and we'll see how that actually comes about. But backing up a little bit and returning to the meaning of sentences and the meanings of their constituent parts, most sentences, most basic declarative sentences, and really all kinds of phrase types, describe situations consisting of an event, and usually that event is encoded by a verb, and that event involves particular participants, and those participants are usually encoded by NPs, noun phrases, as well as locations and times of the event. So we can give each of these elements a thematic role label. So I've very simply diagrammed a sentence here at the bottom of the slide to give us a sense of what is an event, what is a participant, etc. So in the sentence, Evan purchased the guava at the supermarket yesterday. We have an event in which there is an exchange of goods, and Evan, the one purchasing the guava, is a participant in the interaction. Purchased is the verb denoting the event around which the participants are organized. The guava is another participant in the event, since it is the thing being purchased. At the supermarket points to the location of the event in question, and yesterday gives us a time frame for the event. Now, each of these broad labels corresponds to a specific thematic role label, and we're going to look at the primary ones right now. So the so-called core or principal thematic roles are these 5 listed here. We have agent, theme, alternatively called patient or undergoer. We have goal, source, and location, alternatively called locative. So these names should be pretty self-explanatory, but we're going to go over them anyways, just to give us a solid sense of what each of these thematic roles refers to. So the agent, broadly speaking, is the entity that instigates or starts the action or event. Agents are typically volitional, which means that they do the action on purpose and they have control over the action. So, for example, in the sentence, Eleanor defeated the dragon, Eleanor, highlighted in red here, is our agent. She is the one instigating the action, She is volitional in the act of defeating the dragon, and we should hope she has control over that process. The second thematic role, the theme, is the entity undergoing the effect of the action or undergoing the effect of some change, or it could be the entity to which some property is attributed, in the case where you have a sentence composed primarily of an adjective. So I have 3 examples here. Gilbert delivered the package. So in this instance, Gilbert would be our agent, whereas package is the theme. It is the thing undergoing the process of being delivered. Similarly, if we have a single argument verb like fell, in the vase fell, the vase is the theme. It's undergoing the action of falling, but it is not an agent because it isn't volitional, nor does it have control. Similarly, that breadfruit is huge. Here, the adjective huge is being ascribed, this property huge is being ascribed to the entity that breadfruit. So the breadfruit is the theme. It is the one to which that property is attributed. All right, these 2 are really probably the most important and most frequently occurring of the thematic roles. So it's important that we have a solid understanding of what's referred to by agent and patient. But these next 3 are important as well. So goal, as its name would imply, is the endpoint of a movement. Not necessarily motion verbs, but even verbs of transfer, like purchase or deliver, or verbs of like throwing verbs, to throw, to toss, etc. So in this example, Keanu sailed to Maui. Maui is the goal. It is the endpoint of the action sailing. The opposite of that is the source, which is the starting point of a movement. So in our example, the winds blew from the east, where the east is that starting point of the action to blow. Lastly, we have a locative, or location, which is simply the place where the event occurs. So for example, Kapiolani built her house in Manoa Valley. Manoa Valley is the location of the action building. And just to reinforce our understanding, Kapiolani is the agent. She is instigating the act of building. She has control over it. And her house is the theme. It is the element which is undergoing the process of being built. Okay. Now, onto the peripheral, quote-unquote, thematic roles. These are thematic roles that are not as frequently occurring as roles like agent and patient, or even location or goal, but they are still important ones for us to pay attention to. So the first one is experiencer. This is an entity that experiences a psychological state. For example, Jiahe knows that he will get into grad school. So Jiahe is the one experiencing knowing. the psychological state of knowing. Similarly, Mao Yong is afraid of scary movies. Mao Yong experiences the state of fear, so he is the experiencer. Next is the benefactive, or the beneficiary. This is the entity that benefits from an action. So whatever action is encoded by the verb, the beneficiary is the one who gains from it. So for example, Professor Song found the book for her student, so the student benefited from the action of her professor finding the book. Or another way we could phrase this is Professor Song found her student the book. But in both cases, her student is the beneficiary, the one benefiting from the act of finding. Next is the instrument, or the means, the entity used by the agent in order to bring about the event. So for example, Auntie stirred the soup with a spoon. So the action of stirring was instigated with the instrument, a spoon. It is the tool that Auntie uses to stir the soup. A causer is a type of agent. So a causer is actually kind of a subcategory of agent. So causes are agents who bring about an event involving another participant. So they are not necessarily the ones doing the action, but they cause the action, or they cause someone else to do the action. For example, Uncle made the child cry. Uncle is not the one crying, but he causes the child, who is the agent, to cry. And then lastly, we have commutatives, accompanying some other entity, typically the agent. So for example, Keone went fishing with his friends. His friends are the commutative roles here. They are doing it with the agent, Keone. Now it's worth pointing out that thematic roles, because they are semantically defined, necessarily constitute a bit of a continuum. So depending on how fine-grained you want to make your analysis, you could, in theory, propose an enormous number of different thematic roles. However, for descriptive purposes, that's not necessarily beneficial unless it is reflected in the grammar of the language itself and actually helps elucidate differences in behavior between different grammatical components. Now, because of this, thematic role labels have to sometimes be applied figuratively or a little bit metaphorically in order to make maximum use out of them. So for example, the term goal might be used to mark the endpoint of a movement, but it might also mark, it could also sometimes mark a beneficiary. So maybe if I gave the present to my mother could be construed as both the beneficiary of the action give and the goal of the action give. So there is certainly overlap between these thematic roles. And you could continue to make fine-grained divisions between the different types. But for our purposes, we're going to stick to these main ones because they are the ones that are most helpful for initial syntactic description. Okay, so now just to practice a little bit and to introduce another term that I'm sure you've heard before. So how do we know what thematic roles actually occur in a sentence? So we know this because thematic roles are said to be subcategorized by a verb. Or even a preposition. So it's the participants implied by that verb or by that preposition that tell us what thematic roles are present. And these thematic roles are what we call arguments. These are elements whose role is determined by the word's meaning. So for our first example, in Hiroshi hit the ball, the verb hit implies two participants, right? It implies a person hitting and a thing being hit, which means that the verb hit subcategorizes agent and theme. So in this sentence, the noun phrase Hiroshi gets the agent role, and the ball is the theme role, which perhaps seems very obvious, but this becomes beneficial to us once we start talking about grammatical relations in our next section. All right. And now just to show how it's not just verbs that can subcategorize thematic roles, but also prepositions, we have the sentence, Yuko traveled from Tokyo to Honolulu. So the verb travel subcategorizes a single argument, an agent, the person doing the traveling. However, the preposition from subcategorizes a source thematic role, and the preposition to subcategorizes a goal thematic role, right? So these prepositions, at least in English, tell us very clearly what the thematic role of its constituent is, of its argument is. So now this, it's worth also stopping for a moment here to quickly point out that verbs assign thematic roles in every language, but not every language has prepositions. So these kinds of source or goal thematic roles might be associated with particular affixes, inflectional affixes, or with some other element in the sentence. But by and large, they are most often assigned by or associated with prepositions and inflectional affixes. Okay, now I know I'm moving a little bit quickly here, but hopefully so far this has been intuitive enough that you've been able to apply these concepts to the examples we've looked at without too much difficulty. So in the next section, we're going to look at why thematic roles are actually beneficial for syntactic analysis, even though they are primarily semantic. So thematic roles themselves don't actually permit us to give any kind of detailed description of a language's syntax. However, they do permit us to identify structural differences between sentences that are otherwise very similar. And when you have structurally different sentences that all have the same verb with the same noun phrases, all bearing the same thematic roles, we call these thematic paraphrases because at a semantic level, they are identical. However, syntactically, by looking at where the thematic roles are falling in the sentence, we can start to actually probe at what is structurally different between these sentences and start to characterize the underlying syntactic structure. So for example, the sentence, Seru gave a coconut to Cecilia, we have Seru. Well, first of all, the verb give subcategorizes three arguments, an agent, a theme, and a goal, right? So the person doing the giving, the thing being given, and the person to whom it is being given. And in this first sentence, we see that, and in all these sentences, really, we see that Seru is the agent, the one doing the giving, coconut is the theme, the thing being given, and Cecilia is the goal, or even the benefactive. She is the one benefiting from the act of giving. She's receiving the coconut. So we have four possible thematic paraphrases of the same event. Seru gave a coconut to Cecilia. Seru gave Cecilia a coconut was given to Cecilia by Seru, or Cecilia was given a coconut by Seru. Now, we're not going to have enough time today to talk about voice and systems of alignment, but it's worth pointing out that this kind of mapping of thematic roles onto subjects, objects, and indirect objects is a process called diathesis. And here we see examples of active voice sentences in English, and these are passive voice sentences in English. Now I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but this is a nice example of how we see that in each of these instances, we find different prepositions, right? There's a to here in front of Cecilia, whereas there's no to in front of Cecilia here. Here we find a by. Okay, welcome back, part 2. So we got cut off for whatever reason, the live stream. And I did not notice until a little bit after, so thank you all for waiting around while we restarted. So I'm going to go back to where it cut off and continue the workshop. Okay, so right when the live stream cut out, we were talking about thematic paraphrase and how by looking at where the thematic roles fall in the sentence, we can actually begin to identify structural differences between the sentences that we're looking at. So like we mentioned before, in our first sentence, we notice that the goal is marked with to in this case, but not here. So that would be something we would want to investigate to see what's happening there and if there's any syntactic implications for that. Similarly, we can see that coconut is at the beginning of the sentence here, whereas Seru, the agent, is now suddenly marked by the preposition by. And in this sentence, we see Seru marked by again, whereas Cecilia, the goal, is now in the front. So I'm not going to have time today to talk about voice systems, but voice systems in languages, you've probably heard of active voice and passive voice. They're concerned with the mapping of thematic roles onto grammatical relations, onto things like subjects, objects, and indirect objects. So not only can thematic roles help us begin to identify grammatical relations, which we'll talk about next, but once we have a sense for that, we can use the thematic roles to see how sentences that have the same meaning might actually be structurally different. Okay. We can also use thematic roles to do basic investigation into cross-linguistic comparison of syntactic patternings. Essentially, we can use thematic roles to compare how different the word orders in different languages. Basically, by comparing particular configurations of thematic roles and seeing how they're expressed in different languages. So again, we have examples from 3 languages here, English and Hawaiian, of course, and then also Korean. So in English, the agent went to Oahu. Not the agent, excuse me, the woman. The woman is the agent, and Oahu is the goal. Now in the Hawaiian version of this sentence, our verb is here in the front now, wahele aku, and then our agent, kawahine, follows it, and then I Oahu. The goal is after that. Now compared to Korean, and you'll have to excuse my Korean pronunciation, plus this is romanized, kunameaka, the agent, Oahu kata. We have the agent, the goal, and the verb. So by simply identifying the thematic roles in these sentences, we can actually get a preliminary picture of how languages might differ in something like their word order. Now, it's also worth noting that we could see that in both Hawaiian and English, goals tend to come before a preposition, whereas in Korean, a goal seems to be marked with inflection, with a suffix. So that is one instance in which a thematic role can actually give us insight into the structure of the language itself, because it can clue us into patterns of morphological or syntactic patterns of marking elements in the clause. Okay, so now we're going to move on to grammatical relations. Grammatical relations are the structural relationships that hold between a head and its arguments. So whereas thematic roles are entirely semantically defined, grammatical relations are syntactically defined. So the key grammatical relations that will concern us here are the subject, the direct object, the indirect object, and the oblique. And now, unfortunately, I'm not going to have time today to talk about the syntactic properties of these grammatical relations. So it will suffice for the purposes of this webinar to simply show you how we can use thematic roles to identify grammatical relations and how knowledge of grammatical relations can help us make adequate descriptions of the basic syntactic properties of the languages that we're documenting. So we can begin to identify grammatical relations using a process called semantic bootstrapping, which is simply the use of thematic roles to identify grammatical relations in a preliminary and tentative way. And I really want to emphasize preliminary and tentative here because there is no one-to-one relationship between thematic roles and grammatical relations. They are 2 separate things. And while there are trends in how they overlap, there is never a strict one-to-one correspondence. So we can actually, though, make 2 generalizations about the mapping of thematic roles onto grammatical relations that are actually very useful in preliminary syntactic analysis and description. So the first generalization is that in a language's most common pattern for describing a deliberate action by a person or thing, the agent will most likely be expressed as the subject of that sentence, and then the theme will most likely be expressed as the direct object. Now again, this might seem pretty intuitive, but we'll see in a minute examples where this actually gets a little bit turned on its head. So I need to emphasize here that this whole only really generally treated as true in a language's most basic pattern for encoding an event. And again, reemphasize that these are preliminary diagnostics, so they would have to be followed up later. But it is useful in at least identifying how a language might encode its grammatical relations. So in our English sentence here, the dog ate the bone. The verb ate subcategorizes two thematic roles, two arguments, an agent and a theme, right? So the one doing the eating and the thing being eaten. And in English, we know that the dog, the agent, we can just preliminarily say, okay, the dog is the agent, so we're going to say that's the subject. Whereas the bone is the theme, so we're going to preliminarily identify that as the direct object. So now from here, we would go on to say, all right, now in English, it looks like there's a correlation between word order and grammatical relations. So it looks like, since agents are usually expressed as subjects, and if we see consistently that agents appear before the verb, then we'd say, all right, subjects are encoded by a preverbal position. Similarly, we assume that the theme is the direct object, and then we consistently see in these basic patterns in English that the theme occurs immediately after the verb. Without any additional prepositional marking, we would say, okay, so English encodes theme by its position, its post-verbal position, and lack of preposition. Now, as a quick side note, a verb's subject and direct object are oftentimes referred to as its core arguments. Now, this concept of core versus non-core arguments is not going to be relevant for today's webinar, but it's a useful term to be familiar with if you're reading through literature or other syntactic descriptions or grammars, and they reference core arguments. At least you know that they are most likely referring to the subject and the direct object grammatical relations. Now, generalization number 2 follows a very similar line of logic. In a language's most common pattern for describing the transfer of an object from one person to another, the goal is likely to be expressed as an indirect object. So again, turning to English, for example, Alice sells the painting to the customer. Again, we can first identify the thematic roles. Alice is the agent. She's doing the selling. The painting is the theme. It's the thing being sold. It's being transferred. And the customer is the goal. It is the endpoint of the act of selling, or the beneficiary. It is the one who benefits. Now, by using semantic bootstrapping, we would go one step further and say Alice is the subject, the painting is the direct object, and the customer is the indirect object. And again, from there, we would then note any other structural properties that seem to correlate to these relationships, whether that's word order, or in the case of English indirect objects, the use of the preposition to. So, spoiler alert, the word order and the preposition to are indeed how English encodes subject, object, and indirect object. But that is not always the case. So it is